Thomas Greaves heard the gunshot before he saw the smoke. 3 riders crested the desert ridge. Their horses kicked up dust clouds that hung in the still air like battle flags. Thomas dropped his shovel and reached for the Winchester leaning against a fence post. 12 years of silence had taught him to read danger in the wind. The riders came hard and fast. Thomas squinted through the heat shimmer. These weren't townspeople. Their coats were dark, their movements sharp. Government men, maybe, or worse. But they weren't after him. They swept past his gate without slowing, heading north toward the Apache settlements. Thomas watched them disappear into the desert haze. He'd learned long ago not to get involved. The fever that took his wife Mary had also taken his trust in the world. Since then, the ranch had been his fortress. His horses never betrayed him. His cattle never broke promises. His coffee never disappointed him, even when it tasted like dirt. The desert stretched for miles around his land, dry and empty, like the heart of the man who called it home. Thomas had once been a husband, a lover, a dreamer. Now he was just a man with a shovel, a gun, and memories he kept buried deep. That evening, the sky burned orange. The wind carried the scent of dust and dying cactus blooms. Thomas was oiling his saddle when he heard something that didn't belong. A soft knock, not on his door but on the outer gate. He froze. No one knocked on his gate, not in 12 years. Not even the mailman came this far out. His hand moved to the rifle by the post, but he didn't lift it yet. 3 figures stood in the fading light. Women, Apache. They looked exhausted. Dust clung to their dresses. Their hair hung tangled and dry. The youngest could barely stay on her feet. The eldest stepped forward. Her voice was raspy but steady. "Please, we need shelter." Thomas said nothing. His heart hammered against his ribs like a warning drum. He studied their faces. They weren't just tired. They were afraid. They kept glancing back over their shoulders like ghosts might follow. He didn't ask why they were there. Didn't ask what had happened. Didn't ask their names. He opened the gate and stepped aside. They entered without speaking, bowing their heads in quiet thanks. Thomas led them to the barn. He laid out blankets in the loft, brought them water and bread, never said a word. That night, as they slept in the hay, Thomas sat in his cabin staring into the flames. The fire danced, casting long shadows like ghosts from the past. He thought of Mary, her smile, her laugh, the way she used to leave notes tucked under his coffee cup. He hadn't let anyone in since her death. Why had he let them in tonight? Something in their eyes. Something raw and human and broken. Something that looked like his own reflection in the mirror. The next morning, the women were still there. They hadn't run, hadn't stolen anything. The eldest was fetching water from a well. The youngest was tending his chickens. The middle one, barely 20, was sweeping his porch. He should have told them to leave, but the words wouldn't come. Days passed, then a week. They spoke little, only when needed. The eldest introduced herself as Niley. The others were Kiona and Sime, sisters from the north. Thomas didn't press for details. They told him little. He asked even less. The silence between them wasn't cold like the emptiness that had haunted his ranch for years. It was soft, respectful. At night, they cooked over the fire in the yard. They hummed strange lullabies that reminded Thomas of things he didn't want to feel. One evening, as he cleaned his boots nearby, he caught himself watching them laugh. Real, free laughter. It made his chest ache. He'd forgotten what laughter sounded like. One night, a storm came. Harsh winds and flashing skies. Thunder that shook the ground. The women were in the barn, but Thomas couldn't sleep. He walked to the door and saw May sitting outside, soaked and crying. Without thinking, he grabbed his coat and walked into the rain. He sat beside her. "You all right?" he asked. His first words to a woman in 12 years. She looked up with wide eyes, then slowly nodded. "Just scared," she whispered. "Me too," he said, barely audible above the rain. They sat in silence as the storm raged, but something had changed. From that night on, he spoke a little more. Not much, but enough. Enough to ask Niley if she needed blankets. Enough to ask Kiona if the hens were laying. Enough to say stay safe before riding out to check the herd. The walls he'd built so carefully, brick by brick, began to crack, but he still didn't ask why they were there. Not until the day he saw the tracks. Boot prints, 6 of them, heavy, coming from the west, the same direction the women had traveled. The track stopped at the edge of his property, then turned around. Someone was looking for them. Thomas cleaned his rifle that night. He didn't say anything to the women, didn't want to frighten them, but he moved his cot closer to the door. Something told him this wasn't over. The next morning, Niley came to the porch. Her face was calm but firm. "You know, don't you?" Thomas nodded. She sat beside him, folding her hands. "We escaped from a government camp. The men there—" She looked away, jaw tight. "They were cruel. We ran. Didn't think we'd make it. Then we found you." Thomas didn't speak, but something inside him shifted. Maybe they were running from danger. Maybe bringing them here had put him in danger too. But for the first time in 12 years, he didn't care. He looked out across the desert and said quietly, "You're safe here." The silent rancher was silent no more. He stood from the porch and walked to the gun rack. Whatever was coming, he'd be ready. After that morning on the porch, trust settled between them like morning dew. No longer fragile, but real, the kind that doesn't need many words. Each day, the ranch grew more alive. Kiona mended torn curtains and fixed the old rocking chair. May proved herself gifted with horses, whispering to them like old friends. Niley worked the garden like she'd lived on the land forever. Thomas found himself changing too. He woke before the rooster to brew extra coffee. 1 cup for himself, 3 more left quietly on the barn table. He no longer ate in silence. He sat outside in the evenings, listening to Apache songs drifting on the breeze. Sometimes he even chuckled at May's stories about wild horses and desert spirits. But the peace couldn't last forever. One dusty afternoon, as Thomas chopped wood near the fence, he spotted movement in the distance. 3 men on horseback. He narrowed his eyes. These weren't ranchers or townspeople. Their movements were sharp, searching, deliberate. They weren't just passing through. Thomas walked back to the cabin, calm on the outside, but every step carried quiet tension. That night, after dinner, he cleaned his rifle by the fire. Niley watched from across the yard. The flames danced in her eyes. "They've found us, haven't they?" she said softly. Thomas nodded. She sat beside him, folding her hands. "They won't leave us alone. We broke away from something they control. Men like that don't like losing control." Thomas's jaw tightened. "I figured." Niley's voice grew softer. "You don't have to get involved. We'll leave by sunrise. You've done enough." Thomas shook his head. "No, you're not running again." She blinked. "You don't even know us, Thomas." He looked at her with firm eyes. "I know enough." He stood, picked up his rifle, and walked into the darkness, toward the barn, toward the road, toward whatever came next. The men returned the following day. This time they came straight to the gate. 3 of them in dusty coats, cold eyes. The leader was tall with a scar across his left cheek. He didn't bother to smile. "We're looking for 3 Apache girls, runaways from the federal camp near Tucson." He rested a hand on his pistol, but heard they passed through here. Thomas stood firm, rifle in hand but not aimed yet. "Didn't see anyone," he said plainly. The man narrowed his eyes. "Funny, that barn smells like stew and horsehair. You sure you're not hiding something, old man?" Thomas didn't flinch. "I said what I said." The leader chuckled darkly. "Now listen, we've got orders. These girls aren't just runaways. They're property of the state. They broke laws." "Then go get a warrant," Thomas replied coldly. The man leaned closer. "We don't need a warrant when dealing with savages. Now move aside." That's when Thomas lifted his rifle. "I don't think you understand," he said slowly. "You walk past this gate, you won't be walking back." The 3 men hesitated. They hadn't expected resistance from an aging rancher. But in Thomas's eyes was something more dangerous than fear. Conviction. A long, tense silence followed. Desert wind whistled through the fence posts. Somewhere a hawk cried overhead. Then the leader spat in the dirt and turned his horse. "You'll regret this, Greaves." Thomas didn't respond. He waited until they disappeared into the horizon. Then he lowered his rifle and exhaled slowly. Behind him, the 3 women had been watching. Sime ran to him first, tears in her eyes. Kiona followed, wrapping her arms around his waist. But it was Niley who spoke first. "You didn't have to protect us." Thomas looked at her, voice low. "I wanted to." From that day forward, they stopped being guests. They became family. The women moved into the cabin, helping with repairs and painting old walls. They built a new hen house together. Thomas taught Kiona how to shoot, just in case. Sime read every book he owned, sometimes aloud while Thomas sat on the porch carving wood. Niley became something more than company. One night by the fire, she sat beside him closer than ever before. "You lost someone, too," she said softly. Thomas nodded. "My wife. Fever took her long ago." Niley waited. Then she placed her hand over his. Warm, gentle, present. They sat like that for a long while, not speaking. No words were needed. Months passed. The ranch flourished. The women planted herbs and painted the barn red. They carved patterns into porch posts. Travelers passing by would stop, curious about the sudden life in the once lonely property. But none dared bother them. Thomas smiled more. He laughed. He even danced once, awkwardly, during a night of music and stories by the fire. Sime had pulled him up, and he'd shuffled his boots until he gave up and just stood there clapping, red-faced but happy. One evening, as stars came out, he looked around at the flickering lights in the windows, the smell of bread from the oven, the soft sound of Niley's voice humming in the next room. He realized something important. He wasn't alone anymore, not just in the house, but in his heart. One morning, Thomas rode into town for supplies. The clerk, surprised to see him smiling, asked, "You finally got help on the ranch?" Thomas nodded. "Family," he said simply. That night, Niley brought him a carved wooden pendant shaped like a hawk. "In our stories," she said, "the hawk is the spirit that guards those who are wounded. It sees everything from above, protects without needing thanks." Thomas took it carefully, running a finger over the smooth edges. "I don't need a spirit to protect me," he said with a soft smile. "I have you." Niley blushed. In the quiet warmth of the fire, Their hands found each other again. This time he didn't let go. The silent rancher, who hadn't spoken to a woman in 12 years, now lived among three. They didn't just change his home. They healed his soul. He'd save them from danger. But in truth, they'd save him from himself. Under the desert stars, with a hawk pendant warm against his chest, Thomas Greaves finally understood. Sometimes the best way to find yourself is to open your gate to others. The ranch was quiet now, but it was no longer empty.